Bali's abandoned plane. Some abandoned places are a little more obscure than others. Take the abandoned plane in Bali, for example. Nobody knows about this place, and yet it is very cool. There is an abandoned Boeing 737 sitting in the southern part of Bali, and nobody knows how it got there. It's about 5 minutes from the popular Pandawa beach, and yet it's something of a secret that mostly only locals know about. The plane appears to have landed properly with no sign of a crash or some kind of catastrophic failure. It obviously missed the airport and decided to touch down near the jungle instead, but it's really crazy that nobody noticed a Boeing 737 touching down. And as for the people who left it there, nobody knows where they went. Someone would have had to land the plane, get out, and then find their way to civilization. According to some locals, the plane was supposed to be converted into a restaurant for tourists, but this is just a rumor. Nobody knows if the owner of the plane ran out of money, if they just ran out of gas and had no choice but to land, or exactly what happened. The aircraft is now surrounded by a few shipping containers and a particularly shabby hut. For those in the know, it's a great day trip to get away from the beach. It's easy enough to explore, and just 5 miles, 8 kilometers north, is yet another abandoned 737 sitting next to a Dunkin' Donuts. It seems that Bali is basically a graveyard for random airplanes that nobody knows about. Discovery Island. One of the strangest abandoned places that nobody knows about is Discovery Island. What's really crazy is that this abandoned island is located in the center of Disney World in Florida. Thousands of visitors hang out at Disney World every day and have no idea that there is an abandoned island with a horrifying past just beyond their favorite rides. But just what is going on with this island? It's located in Bay Lake, and it's a huge landmass that can only be reached by boat. Before Disney purchased the land, it had been used as a hunting retreat. Before it was Discovery Island, it opened in 1974 as Treasure Island. There was a shipwreck, treasures, and other pirate-themed nonsense. But in 1976, the island was renamed Disney's Discovery Island. Disney turned it into a tropical paradise with interesting plants and beautiful birds. But this turned out to be a huge disaster. The park was abandoned and forgotten in 1998 after 25 years of operation, and it happened after a pretty grim scandal. It turned out that some of the employees at Discovery Island were up to no good. There were reports of widespread animal abuse, including employees smashing the eggs of birds, hitting birds with sticks, and even shooting at them with guns. It was an absolutely horrifying place, and according to a 1990 report from the Orlando Sentinel, Walt Disney World had to pay a massive fine to settle 16 animal cruelty charges held against them and 5 of their employees. Darby Island and the Haunted Castle. The Bahamas is supposed to be a beautiful and relaxing place where you can take your family on a quiet vacation, but nobody knows there is a private island in the Bahamas purported to be haunted. The island also has a secret Nazi castle abandoned in the middle of its lush forest. The castle is known as Darby Castle, and it was apparently built as a working plantation back in 1938. During World War II, the plantation was the largest employer in the southern Bahamas. The workers produced palm oil, fruit, and they even worked with goats, and even though the castle is now in ruins, the legend of its horrors persist. Some claim that the Englishman who lived in the castle was a Nazi sympathizer. Some even say the ghosts of the Englishman and his mistress have never wanted to leave the island and are still there today. The island has 554 acres of land, completely abandoned and not lived in. When exactly the island was left unattended is still something of a mystery. Even more interesting is that the unknown island has some pretty wealthy neighbors. It's been reported that Nicolas Cage, Johnny Depp, and even David Copperfield each own their own private island residences near Darby Island and its abandoned Nazi castle. Have you ever discovered an unknown or unique abandoned place while exploring? Tell me about your discovery. Post about how you found it and what was there in the comments below. Then remember to subscribe to Talltanic if you have not already for more awesome and fun videos just like this one. Ordos. There are some pretty fabulous places in China. All things considered, it is home to some pretty incredible monuments, a rich and interesting history, and the most revolutionary architecture on the planet. It's also home to many ghost cities, including this one. Ordos is being called the world's largest ghost town. According to Business Insider, the local government threw a ton of money at an urban development project in the early 2000s after a coal mining boom. They had hoped to create a massive epicenter for culture, economy, and politics. This place was named Ordos Newtown. It would be able to hold 1 million people, and it was created with the most advanced sports venues, incredible architectural projects, and massive residential towers. Unfortunately, nobody settled in the city. In 2016, there were only 100,000 people living there. That's just 1/10 of its space being filled. A visit to this strange city feels like arriving at a post-apocalyptic space station. The architecture is amazing and highly advanced, the city is huge, and yet there is nobody living there. There are empty streets, huge residential towers without a single person living in them, and luxury homes still new without a single resident. Even more incredible is the Art and City Museum that does not have any visitors. There's a huge stadium with no games being played. There are also abandoned villas and empty schools. It's the most low-key ghost town in the world, and nobody knows about it. SS City of Adelaide. Australia is home to the coolest animals in the world. Most of the country is also a barren wasteland. Off the shores of Australia, there is one of the strangest sights you will ever see, and because of its total isolation, nobody even knows it's there. I'm talking about the SS City of Adelaide, which launched back in 1863 from Glasgow en route to Sydney. It operated for 30 years as a passenger ship before being transformed into a vessel for sailing. But then in 1912, the ship caught on fire. It burned for several days before anyone managed to extinguish the flames. It was then purchased by a rich resident of Australia who wanted to use it for his own personal business. While the ship was being towed to its destination, it ran aground in Cockle Bay. It was then abandoned. All these years later, the SS City of Adelaide is still sitting in the bay in ruins and overgrown with trees. There is a literal forest growing out of this half-sunken boat. It's been completely reclaimed by nature, and there are no plans to scrap it anytime soon. In fact, the ship is located in a remote region of an Australian marine park, which means it has special protection. There are no commercial fishermen allowed in the area because they could disturb the SS City of Adelaide and its peaceful ecosystem. Shade Swamp Sanctuary. The Shade Swamp Sanctuary is one of the freakiest unknown places in Connecticut. It's a zoo from the era of the Great Depression, located just off the highway, completely abandoned, broken down into an ugly ruin, and pretty much nobody knows it's there. You can find the zoo off Route 6 in Connecticut, and people drive by it every day without knowing its story or what even it is. But here's the scoop. The zoo was once part of a massive preserve known as Shade Swamp Sanctuary. It began as a wildlife rehabilitation operation in the 1930s where injured animals were rehabilitated and then released into the wild. These were birds, bears, and all kinds of other crazy animals. There was also a breeding program for raccoons and rabbits because people hunted them so much during the Great Depression because they had no food to eat. But then came the issue. People began to hear about the zoo, and so they would bring in the exotic pets that they didn't want anymore, such as monkeys and giraffes. It became too much for the zoo to handle. They didn't have enough funding, and by the 1960s it was completely abandoned and left to rot. It's unclear what happened to all the animals, but it probably was not anything good. What's really interesting is that the whole area is now protected and on the National Register of Historic Places, but only because of a wooden shelter constructed in the sanctuary back in 1934 by members of the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's because of this artifact that Shade Swamp Sanctuary cannot be destroyed. The National Capitol Columns. The Capitol Columns are one of the lesser-known historical sites in Washington, D.C. These sandstone columns supported the east portico of the United States Capitol way back in the early 1800s, but in 1958 they were replaced with new marble columns. The United States government wasn't sure what to do with the originals, so they put them in storage until 1984. Then they decided to put them on display at the National Arboretum, but it turned out that nobody cared about the old columns. Even though they had been used as part of extremely important inaugurations between 1828 and 1958, such as Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, they are currently abandoned in an open field and nobody goes to visit them. Nobody even knows they're there. The Rutland Prison Camp. The Rutland Prison Camp is another unknown abandoned place that deserves way more attention. It's buried deep in the forest of western Massachusetts, and some people even say the ruins of the old Rutland Prison Camp are haunted. The camp was apparently used in the 1800s and the early 1900s as a prison that housed minor offenders and those who had committed non-violent crimes. In those days, that meant people who were charged with public intoxication or avoiding taxation. The inmates were forced to do farm work and they lived in minimum security lodgings. But as the years went by, the camp grew and grew. More and more prisoners were sent to it, and it was abandoned out of nowhere in 1934 because of a massive complication with the water supply. It seemed that the prison camp could not sustain a large population, and it was abruptly forgotten. This was actually a huge issue in the 1900s as jails, hospitals, and asylums all began to see massive waves of overcrowding. The ruins can still be seen in the forest if you know where to look, and it's a pretty ghostly sight. If not for the layers of bright and annoying graffiti sprayed all over the stone, it would definitely be a lot creepier. The Rodney Ghost Town. Speaking of creepy, the Rodney ghost town in Mississippi is certainly the most disturbing place in recent memory. It's also extremely difficult to find and almost nobody knows it's there. The only way to find Rodney is to locate the Old Country store on Highway 61. From the store, you have to turn down a road that does not even look like a road. You will pass by the Cane Ridge Cemetery, so you know you're getting into seriously creepy territory. Then the road stops after about 12 miles, 20 kilometers. From there, you will find yourself in the middle of the city of Rodney. It had once been a bustling town on the Mississippi River, but today nobody lives there. It is a horrifying sight to behold and not somewhere you want to spend the night. The town also has a pretty disturbing history. Rodney was incorporated in 1828 according to Mississippi Folklife and had about 20 buildings stretching away from the river. The town grew to hold about 200 residents, a few stores, and even the first opera house in the state of Mississippi. But in 1843, the town was struck by an epidemic of yellow fever. Then it happened again in 1847. So many people died, the town became depopulated. Residents were forced to flee because of fear of disease, which many of them suspected came from New Orleans. But despite all the death and pestilence, Rodney still became an extremely busy port on the Mississippi River after the 1850s. There was another population boom, which resulted in at least 4,000 residents by 1860. The town was even more popular than Jackson. But as with a lot of things in the South, the Civil War spelled disaster. Many people moved out of the region, many of those who had gotten rich off the backs of slaves were forced to change their way of life, and by 1930, Rodney was no longer an official town. The river flooded, the structures diminished, and the town gradually died. But it still survived quite a while. It was not until 2011 that every last resident was gone and Rodney turned into an official ghost town. Flying saucer homes. A lot of people don't know that there are flying saucer homes from the 1960s spread across the globe. These are known as the Futuro houses, and they are in essence the last remaining physical manifestations of the optimism felt in the 1960s. They look exactly like flying saucers and were prefabricated vacation homes built to easily adapt to just about any terrain. You could put them on the side of a mountain or on a beach. But the remaining flying saucer homes from the 60s are now spread across the globe. Almost all of them are abandoned, and they can be seen from the beaches of Australia to the snowy tundra of Russia. It's unclear how these weird spaceship houses got distributed so far across the planet, but it's believed that there are at least a dozen of them still decaying throughout the world. One of them is abandoned in Royce City, Texas. Another can be found near Frisco in North Carolina. And if you dig deep enough, you could travel most of the world searching for the rest of these abandoned UFOs. What do you think? Are you up for it? Would you visit any of these mysterious locations? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and be sure to come back soon for more amazing content right here on Talltanic.